June 14, 2024, the day Russia stopped pretending. Let me tell you about the moment I realized we were no longer watching a proxy war, but the early stages of a great power confrontation that could reshape the global order. It wasn't the latest Ukrainian counteroffensive, nor was it the much-hyped F-16 deliveries. It was something far more subtle, yet far more a quiet shift in Russian rhetoric, a hardening of Moscow's red lines, and most importantly, the way Western policymakers chose to ignore it. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying great power competition, from the Cold War's endgame to the rise of China, the forever wars in the Middle East, and now this slow-motion collision between Russia and the West. And what I saw on June 14 wasn't just another escalation, it was the moment Russia stopped negotiating with itself. The day it decided that the West's strategic ambiguity was no longer a bluff to be called, but a threat to be met with irreversible action. That was the day Colonel Douglas Russia is no longer playing for limited objectives in Ukraine. It is playing for survival. And if we don't understand that, we are sleepwalking into a conflict that will make the last 2 years look like a prelude. Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about one thing. The official narrative, the one you've been hearing from Washington, Brussels, and most Western media, goes something like: Russia is losing. Ukraine is holding the line. The West's economic sanctions are crippling Moscow's war machine. NATO's unity is unshakable. And if we just keep sending more weapons, more money, and more moral support, Kiev will eventually push Russian forces back to the 1991 borders, if not all the way to Moscow. That's the story. And on the surface, it's not entirely false. Ukraine has fought with remarkable resilience. Russia has suffered staggering losses, some estimates put their casualties at over 500,000 dead and wounded. The ruble has taken a beating. And NATO has exited, with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance in record time. But here's the problem with this: it's built on a foundation of wishful thinking, willful ignorance, and a dangerous refusal to acknowledge the one thing that actually matters in war: the enemy's will to fight. And right now, Russia's will to fight isn't just intact. It's hardening. The official narrative and why it's dangerously incomplete. Let's start with the facts as they're presented to us. Since February 2022, the West has committed over $200 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. The US alone has sent $75 billion, including advanced systems like HIMARS, Patriot missiles, and now F-16s. The EU has matched this with its own funding, and individual nations, Poland, Germany, the UK, have sent billions more in weapons and training. The stated goal? To help Ukraine win. To push Russia out of all occupied territories, including Crimea. To restore Ukraine's 1991 borders. And, in the words of some hawks, to weaken Russia to the point where it can no longer threaten its neighbors. The data seems to support this optimism. Ukrainian forces have indeed retaken some territory, most notably in Kharkiv in 2022 and Kherson later that year. Russian advances have slowed. Their military, once seen as an unstoppable juggernaut, has been exposed as poorly led, logistically strained, and reliant on Soviet-era equipment. Western intelligence agencies, from the CIA to Britain's MI6, have repeatedly claimed that Russia is running out of steam. That their manpower is depleted. That their economy is on the brink. That Putin is isolated, his generals incompetent, his people restless. And yet, Russia is still fighting. Not just fighting, advancing. In recent months, Russian forces have made slow but steady gains in Donbass. They've taken Avdiivka. They've pushed back Ukrainian counterattacks near Bakhmut. They've exited their control over the southern front. And most alarmingly, they've begun to adapt, reorganizing their command structure, improving their artillery tactics, and even integrating North Korean and Iranian drones into their operations. This isn't the behavior of a country on the verge of collapse. This is the behavior of a country that has accepted a long war and is preparing to win it. But here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. Because if Russia is truly on the ropes, if their economy is in shambles, their military exhausted, their leadership divided, then why are they escalating? Why, in the last 6 months, have exited their nuclear rhetoric, with Putin openly discussing tactical nuclear use and moving nuclear-capable missiles to Belarus? Deepen military cooperation with Iran and North Korea, two pariah states that have become critical suppliers of drones, artillery, and ballistic missiles. Increased their defense budget by 70%, pouring $140 billion into military production in 2024 alone. Conducted large-scale military exercises near NATO's borders, including simulated nuclear strikes on Poland. Threatened direct retaliation against Western nations supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine. These aren't the actions of a country that believes it's losing. These are the actions of a country that has decided it cannot lose and is willing to take extraordinary risks to ensure it doesn't. So what's really going on here? The hidden Russia's existential war. Let me tell you something that most Western analysts won't. Russia is not fighting for territory. It's fighting for survival. This isn't just another border dispute. This isn't even just about NATO action. This is about Russia's place in the world and whether it will be allowed to exist as a great power at all. To understand this, we have to go back further than 2022. We have to go back to the 1990s, when a week in Russia watched as NATO exited eastward, absorbing former Warsaw Pact states and even former Soviet republics. We have to look at the 2008 war in Georgia, where Russia drew its first real red line and was ignored. We have to examine the 2014 annexation of Crimea, where Russia acted decisively to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, only to see the West double down on its support for Kyiv. And we have to understand one fundamental: Russia sees NATO action as an existential threat. Now, I know what some of you are, that's just Putin's propaganda. NATO is a defensive alliance. Russia has nothing to fear. But let's be honest, would the US tolerate a Russian military alliance in Mexico? Would we accept Russian missiles in Cuba? Of course not. And yet we expect Russia to accept NATO on its borders, in countries that were once part of the Soviet Union, in a region that has been invaded by the West twice in the last 200 years. This isn't about whether NATO is defensive or not. It's about spheres of influence, a concept that great powers have understood for centuries. And right now, the US is trying to erase Russia's sphere of influence entirely. That's why, when Putin talks about Ukraine, he doesn't just talk about NATO. He talks about denazification. He talks about Russophobia. He talks about a Western plot to destroy Russia. Now, I'm not saying I agree with him. But I am saying that if we dismiss this as mere propaganda, we're making a catastrophic mistake. Because here's the: Russia is not fighting Ukraine. It's fighting the West. And it's doing so with a clarity of purpose that the West lacks. The broader geopolitical unipolarity versus multipolarity. This war isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the global order. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, the idea that America is the sole superpower, that its military and economic dominance is unchallengeable, and that the rest of the world must either align with Washington or be contained. But that era is ending. China's rise, Russia's resurgence, and the emergence of a non-Western bloc have created a multipolar world, one where power is distributed among multiple centers, and where no single nation can dictate terms to the rest. This is the real fear driving US policy. Not just that Russia might win in Ukraine, but that the very idea of American hegemony might collapse. And that's why this war has become a proxy for a much larger struggle, one that could define the 21st century. Let me break it. 1. The US, the last hegemon. The US is fighting to preserve its dominance. That's why it's pouring billions into Ukraine, not just to help Kyiv, but to weaken Russia, contain China, and signal to the world that defiance of Washington will not be tolerated. But here's the: America's strategy is unsustainable. The US is $34 trillion in debt, with interest payments on that debt now exceeding $1 trillion per year. Its industrial base is hollowed out, forcing it to rely on allies for critical supplies. Its military is overstretched, with commitments from Europe to the Middle East to the Pacific. And its political system is polarized, with growing isolationist sentiment on both the left and the right. The US can't afford to fight a long war in Europe and contain China in the Pacific. And yet, that's exactly what it's trying to do. 2. The desperate revisionist power. Russia knows it can't match the US in a direct confrontation.
So it's using asymmetric means to weaken American energy blackmail, nuclear brinkmanship,
alliances with rogue states,
hybrid warfare. Russia's goal isn't to win in the traditional sense.
It's to make the cost of American dominance so high that Washington is forced to negotiate a new security architecture, one that recognizes Russia's sphere of influence.
3. The silent beneficiary. China is watching this war very closely.
Because if Russia can force the US to accept a multipolar world, one where great powers have their own spheres of influence, then China's own ambitions become far more achievable. That's why China has not condemned Russia's invasion. It's why it's deepening economic ties with Moscow, buying Russian oil at discounted prices, and providing dual-use technology that helps Russia evade sanctions.
China's message is if the US can't stop Russia in Ukraine, how will it stop China in Taiwan?
4. The divided house.
Europe is caught in the middle. On one hand, it's dependent on US security guarantees.
On the other, it's economically tied to Russia and China. This war has exposed Europe's.
Germany's industrial base is collapsing without cheap Russian gas.
France is pushing for strategic autonomy, but lacks the military power to back it up. Eastern Europe is terrified of Russia, but also resents Western dominance. The UK is trying to play both sides, but its influence is fading.
Europe's problem?
It can't defend itself without the US, but it can't afford to follow the US into a long war with Russia. And that's why Europe is quietly pushing for negotiations even as Washington doubles down on total victory.
The military, why the West is losing the long game. Now, let's talk about the military situation.
Because this is where the official narrative collapses entirely.
The West keeps telling us that Ukraine is winning.
That Russia is running out of steam. That if we just send more weapons, more money, more training, Kyiv will eventually prevail.
But the data doesn't support this.
1. Russia's manpower advantage.
Russia has 143 million people. Ukraine has 36 million. Russia has mobilized over 300,000 troops since 2022. Ukraine has lost an estimated 70,000 killed and 120,000 wounded and is struggling to replace them.
Russia is recruiting 30,000 new soldiers per month. Ukraine is facing a manpower crisis, with some units reporting 50% casualties in recent offensives.
This isn't a war of attrition that Ukraine can win. It's a war of demographic collapse. 2. Russia's industrial superiority.
Russia is outproducing the West in artillery shells. It's building tanks at a rate of 100 per month, while Ukraine is losing them faster than they can be replaced. It's integrating Iranian drones, North Korean missiles, and Chinese microelectronics into its war machine. The West, meanwhile, is struggling to ramp up production. The US is years away from matching Russia's output.
And Europe? It's still dependent on American supplies. 3. The escalation ladder.
The West keeps crossing Russian red lines, and Russia keeps responding.
First, it was javelins and stingers. Russia adapted.
Then it was HIMARS and long-range missiles.
Russia moved its command centers deeper into occupied territory. Now, it's F-16s and ATACMS. Russia has threatened to strike NATO supply lines in Poland and Romania. At some point, Russia will retaliate. And when it does, the West will have to: do we escalate further? Or do we back down? Because here's the thing about it's not a one-way street.
The US has spent decades fighting asymmetric wars where it could bomb from 30,000 feet with impunity. But Russia is a peer competitor with nuclear weapons.
And that changes everything. The domestic political why this war won't end anytime soon. Now, let's talk about the one factor that most analysts: domestic politics. Because this war isn't just about geopolitics.
It's about elections, voter sentiment, and the internal power struggles in Washington, Moscow, and Kyiv.
1. The US, a war of political convenience. The Biden administration has staked its legacy on Ukraine. It's not just about defending democracy, it's about proving that America is still the indispensable nation.
But here's the American people are tired of forever wars.
62% of Americans now say the US is doing too much to help Ukraine. Republican support for Ukraine aid has collapsed, with Trump and his allies openly questioning why the US is spending billions overseas while domestic issues go unaddressed.
Swing states like Michigan and Wisconsin, home to large Ukrainian American populations, are key to the 2024 election, meaning Biden can't afford to look weak on Ukraine.
This creates a dangerous. If Ukraine starts losing, Biden will be pressured to escalate. If Ukraine starts winning, the Hawks will push for total victory. Either way, the US is locked into a war it can't afford to lose, but also can't afford to win. 2. A war for Putin's survival. Putin isn't just fighting for Ukraine. He's fighting for his political survival. If Russia loses, Putin's regime collapses. He knows this. His inner circle knows this. If Russia wins, even a limited victory, he solidifies his legacy as the man who restored Russian greatness. If the war drags on indefinitely, he can use it to justify repression at home. This is why Russia cannot accept defeat. And it's why Putin is willing to escalate even if it means risking a direct confrontation with NATO. 3. A nation at the breaking point. Ukraine is exhausted. 30% of its population has fled the country. Its economy has shrunk by 30% since 2022. Its military is running out of men, with some units reporting 80% casualties in recent battles. Corruption is rampant, with reports of weapons being sold on the black market and generals embezzling aid money. Zelensky knows that if he negotiates now, he'll be seen as a traitor. But if he keeps fighting, Ukraine may cease to exist as a functioning state. This is the tragedy of Ukraine's. It's dependent on the West for survival, but the West's goals are not aligned with Ukraine's interests. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the 3 most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. What the war grinds to a stalemate. Russia consolidates control over Donbass, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Ukraine becomes a de facto NATO protectorate, but its borders remain unfixed, with sporadic fighting continuing for years. The West declares a strategic victory because Ukraine hasn't fallen, while Russia declares its own victory because it's secured its land bridge to Crimea. Both sides save face, but neither gets what they actually wanted. Now, what most people don't realize is that this is the least bad outcome for everyone involved except, of course, for the Ukrainians. A frozen conflict would allow the US to pivot away from Europe and refocus on China, while Russia could claim its denazified Ukraine and protected its borders. The problem? Frozen conflicts have a way of thawing. Look at Korea, Cyprus, or even the Donbass after 2014. None of these were ever truly stable. The moment one side feels strong enough, the fighting resumes. And in this case, that moment could come as soon as 2025 or 2026, when Russia's military-industrial complex is fully mobilized and Ukraine's Western backers are distracted by their own elections or economic crises. Let me explain why this matters. A frozen conflict doesn't mean peace, it means a permanent war economy. Russia would keep its society on a wartime footing, justifying repression, censorship, and the suppression of dissent under the guise of national security. Ukraine, meanwhile, would become a militarized rump state, dependent on NATO for its survival but resentful of its inability to retake lost territory. The West would keep pumping in weapons and money, not out of altruism, but because abandoning Ukraine would signal weakness to China, Iran, and North Korea. And that's the uncomfortable. No one in this equation actually wants a real peace. They just want a pause. Scenario 2, the collapse. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. Ukraine's military collapses not because of a single catastrophic defeat, but because of a slow-motion unraveling. We're already seeing the warning signs. In Avdiivka, Ukrainian units held out for months against overwhelming Russian firepower, but when they finally withdrew in February 2024, it wasn't just a tactical retreat, it was a psychological breaking. Morale is fracturing. The New York Times reported in April that entire brigades are refusing to rotate back to the front, citing exhaustion and a lack of ammunition. Meanwhile, Russia is throwing wave after wave of poorly trained but expendable convicts and mobilized troops into the meat grinder, knowing it can afford the losses. Ukraine can't. Here's the wars don't end when one side runs out of bullets. They end when one side runs out of will. And Ukraine's will is eroding.
The 2024 mobilization law, which lowered the conscription age from 27 to 25 and made it easier to draft men with medical exemptions, has sparked protests and a mass exodus of fighting-age men. The Ukrainian government has responded by cracking down, raiding homes, arresting draft dodgers, and even revoking passports.
But repression only works for so long. At some point, the dam breaks. If Ukraine collapses, the consequences would be catastrophic.
Russia would likely push to Kiev, not necessarily to occupy it, but to install a puppet government and force a surrender on its terms. The West would face an impossible: do we escalate directly, risking a nuclear exchange, or do we cut our losses and let Ukraine fall? My money's on the latter, because the alternative is unthinkable. But here's the: a Ukrainian collapse wouldn't just be a defeat for Kiev, it would be a defeat for the entire Western security architecture. If Russia can redraw borders by forcing Europe, what's to stop China from doing the same in Taiwan? Or Iran in the Persian Gulf? The post-World War II order would be dead, and the world would revert to a multipolar free-for-all where might makes right. Scenario 3: the escalation spiral. This is the scenario the hawks in Washington and Brussels are quietly hoping for. The idea is, if we can't win with Ukraine's manpower, we'll win with NATO's firepower. The problem? This isn't 1999, when NATO could bomb Serbia with impunity. Russia is a nuclear-armed state with a doctrine that explicitly allows for the use of tactical nukes if its territorial integrity is threatened. And let's be: Putin has already annexed 4 Ukrainian regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. If NATO starts striking targets inside those regions, Russia will consider it an attack on its own soil. Now, I'm not saying Putin would nuke London or New York over a Ukrainian counteroffensive. But he would use tactical nuclear weapons to break a Ukrainian breakthrough, especially if it threatened Crimea or the land bridge to Russia. And once one nuclear weapon is used, the taboo is broken. The US would have to respond, either with its own tactical nukes or with a conventional escalation that could quickly spiral out of control. This isn't alarmism, it's basic deterrence theory. The whole point of nuclear weapons is to make large-scale conventional wars unwinnable. And yet, we have people in Washington openly talking about degrading Russia's nuclear capabilities or limiting its second strike potential. That's not strategy, that's suicide. Let me put this in historical context. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and USSR came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war. The difference? Both Kennedy and Khrushchev had direct, back-channel communications, and both understood the stakes. Today, we have no such channels. Putin and Biden barely speak, and the people advising them, like Jake Sullivan or Nikolai Patrushev, are ideologues who see this war as an existential struggle. That's a recipe for miscalculation. So where does that leave us? The most likely path forward is a messy combination of all 3 scenarios. Ukraine will keep fighting, but its offensives will become smaller and more desperate. Russia will keep grinding forward, but its advances will slow as it runs out of fresh troops. The West will keep sending weapons, but the aid will become more conditional, tied to reforms that Zelensky can't deliver without losing public support. And in the background, the risk of escalation will grow, not because anyone wants it, but because no one knows how to stop it. Here's the bottom: this war is no longer about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. If Russia wins, we enter a world where great powers can redraw borders by force, and the US is no longer the sole superpower. If the West wins, we enter a world where NATO's action is unlimited, and Russia is permanently contained, or worse, dismembered. Neither outcome is stable. Neither outcome is peaceful. And neither outcome is what the Ukrainian people actually want. The tragedy is that no one in power seems to care. The US is fighting this war to preserve its hegemony. Russia is fighting it to restore its empire. And Ukraine? Ukraine is just the battlefield. The question isn't whether this war will end, it's whether it will end before the world burns. Now, what most people don't realize is that this war isn't just being fought on the battlefields of Donbass or the corridors of Brussels, it's being waged in the domestic politics of every major player, and that's where the real instability lies. Let's start with Russia, because that's where the most dangerous miscalculations are happening.
Putin's regime is not the monolithic, iron-fisted dictatorship Western media often portrays. Yes, he's consolidated power, but Russia's political system is far more fragile than it appears.
The war has exposed deep fractures, not just between the elites and the public, but within the elites themselves. You have hardliners like Nikolai Patrushev, the Security Council secretary, who see this as a civilizational struggle against the West, and you have more pragmatic figures like Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, who understand that endless war will bankrupt the country. Then there's the military-industrial complex, which is thriving, and the oligarchs, who are quietly hemorrhaging money as sanctions bite.
The problem for Putin is that he's trapped between these factions. If he escalates, he risks overcommitting and triggering a domestic backlash. If he compromises, he risks looking weak, and in Russia, weakness is an invitation for a palace coup. Here's the uncomfortable: Putin's survival is now tied to victory in Ukraine.
Not a negotiated settlement, not a frozen conflict, but a clear, unambiguous win. That's why he's doubling down on mobilization, why he's reshuffling his military leadership, and why he's increasingly relying on Wagner Group and other paramilitaries, because the regular army is exhausted. But here's the: every time Russia mobilizes, it destabilizes the home front.
The September 2022 mobilization was a political earthquake.
Protests erupted in Dagestan, Buryatia, and other non-Russian regions, where the burden of conscription falls heaviest.
The Kremlin managed to suppress the unrest, but the resentment didn't disappear. It just went underground.
And now, with rumors of a second mobilization wave, possibly as early as this spring, Putin is playing with fire.
Let me explain why this matters.
In 1917, Russia's collapse didn't start on the front lines of World War I. It started in Petrograd, when exhausted soldiers and starving workers turned against the Tsar.
The parallels aren't exact, but the dynamic is the same.
A prolonged war, economic stagnation, and a leadership that can't deliver victory, these are the ingredients for revolution.
Putin knows this. That's why he's cracking down on dissent, why he's purging officials, why he's relying more on the FSB and less on the military. But repression only works for so long. At some point, the system either delivers results or it breaks.
Now, let's talk about the West, because the domestic politics there are just as volatile and just as dangerous. In the United States, the war in Ukraine has become a proxy for the 2024 election. The Biden administration is trapped between two: impossible. If it pushes for a negotiated settlement, it risks looking weak and handing Trump a cudgel to beat them with.
If it doubles down on military support, it risks escalation with Russia and a potential nuclear crisis that could derail Biden's entire presidency.
The Republicans, meanwhile, are split between the isolationist wing and the hawkish wing. The isolationists want to cut off aid to Ukraine entirely, while the hawks want to go all in, including direct NATO intervention. Neither side has a coherent strategy, but both sides are using Ukraine as a political football.
Here's the: American politics is now so polarized that even a minor shift in public opinion could force a dramatic change in policy. Right now, support for Ukraine is still strong, but it's softening.
A recent Pew Research poll from January 2024 showed that only 31% of Americans believe the U.S. is providing the right amount of support to Ukraine, while 28% say it's too much and 38% say it's too little.
That's a recipe for policy whiplash.
If the Republicans take the White House in November, we could see a sudden cutoff of military aid, which would leave Ukraine defenseless. If Biden wins, we could see a renewed push for escalation, which could drag NATO into direct conflict with Russia.
Either way, the risk of miscalculation is sky high.
Then there's Europe, where the war has exposed deep divisions between the hawks and the doves.
The EU's unity is a myth.
Viktor Orbán has made no secret of his opposition to further aid for Ukraine, and he's not alone. The Dutch government collapsed in July 2023 over disagreements about military support for Kyiv. In Germany, the AfD is surging in the polls, and even the center-right CDU is split over whether to keep sending tanks and missiles. The French, meanwhile, are playing both sides. Macron talks tough about strategic ambiguity, but France's military is stretched thin, and its public is growing weary of the war.
Let me put this in perspective.
In 1914, Europe stumbled into World War I because no one had a clear off-ramp. The alliances were rigid, the leaders were inflexible, and the public was whipped into a frenzy by nationalism. Today, we're seeing the same dynamic. The difference is that in 1914, the weapons were conventional. Today, they're nuclear. And yet, no one in Brussels or Washington seems to be thinking about how to de-escalate. Instead, they're doubling down on the same failed strategies: more sanctions, more weapons, more rhetoric about total victory. So where does that leave us? Let's game out the scenarios. First, the most likely outcome in the short of frozen conflict. Neither side can win, but neither side wants to lose. Russia digs in, Ukraine runs out of manpower, and the West loses interest. This is the Korean War model, a permanent stalemate, with occasional flare-ups. The problem is that frozen conflicts have a way of thawing. Look at Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. After 26 years of stalemate, Azerbaijan launched a blitzkrieg and retook the territory in 6 weeks. The same could happen in Ukraine. If Russia senses weakness, say, if US aid dries up, it could launch another major offensive. If Ukraine senses an opening, say, if Russia's domestic unrest boils over, it could try to retake Crimea. Either way, the risk of escalation remains. Second, the most dangerous: a direct NATO-Russia war. This could happen in one of two ways. The first is through miscalculation. A Ukrainian strike on Russian soil with Western weapons, a NATO supply convoy mistaken for a military target, a Russian missile that accidentally hits a Polish village. Any of these could trigger Article 5. The second is through deliberate escalation. If Ukraine starts losing badly, there's a real possibility that the US or UK could send troops under the guise of training missions or advisors. Russia has already warned that it would consider this a casus belli. And once NATO boots are on the ground, even in small numbers, the risk of a wider war becomes very real. Third, the most destabilizing: regime change in Moscow. This isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. Putin is 71 years old, and his health has been the subject of endless speculation. If he dies or is incapacitated, Russia could descend into chaos. The Siloviki would fight for control, the oligarchs would try to carve up the state, and the regions, especially the non-Russian ones, could push for independence. A power struggle in Moscow would make the 1990s look like a picnic. And in the middle of all this, you'd have a nuclear-armed state with no clear leadership. That's a nightmare scenario for everyone. Now, here's the part no one in Washington or Brussels wants to talk: what happens if Russia wins? Not just in Ukraine, but in the broader sense, if the West accepts that Russia has reasserted its sphere of influence, that NATO's action has limits, that the US is no longer the sole superpower. The establishment narrative is that this would be a catastrophe, that it would embolden China, that it would lead to a new era of great power conflict. But is that really true? Or is it just the same old hegemonic thinking that got us into this mess in the first place? Let me be: I'm not advocating for a Russian victory. I'm saying that the West's refusal to even consider the possibility is dangerous. Because if you assume that Russia can never win, then you assume that the war can never end. And that's how you get stuck in an endless cycle of escalation. The reality is that the post-Cold War order is already dead. The question is, what replaces it? Will it be a multipolar world where great powers negotiate their spheres of influence, like in the 19th century? Or will it be a world of perpetual conflict, where the US and its allies try to maintain dominance at any cost? The first option is messy, but it's stable. The second option is a recipe for disaster. And yet, no one in power seems willing to choose the first option. Why? Because it would require admitting that the US is not invincible, that NATO's action has limits, that Russia is not going to collapse. It would require humility, and humility is in short supply in Washington these days. So here's my: we're heading for a period of prolonged instability. The war in Ukraine will drag on, but it will become a background conflict, like the wars in Syria or Yemen. The real action will be in the domestic politics of the major powers. In Russia, Putin will either consolidate his rule or face a crisis. In the US, the 2024 election will determine whether the war escalates or fizzles out. In Europe, the far right will continue to rise, and the EU's unity will continue to fray. And in the background, the risk of a wider war will grow. Not because anyone wants it, but because no one knows how to stop it. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended because both sides blinked.
Today, no one is blinking.
And that's the most dangerous part of all.